Diana, it's great to have you on the show. You're an old friend of mine, and we met when you came to my church, and we're doing research on congregations in America, and it's wonderful to see you here. What is an example of one of the important stories that most people don't know from Christian history?
Oh, I think that my favorite story in the book, and I think it is a very important story, it gets to the thing I was saying at the end about what would it look like, comes from Samuel Green, who in the 1850s was a freed slave in the state of Maryland who became a Methodist pastor. He had a very successful congregation, and many slaves joined his church, and he began preaching about the freedom in Jesus, and several people in his church disappeared because this particular county in Maryland was one of the centers of the Underground Railroad. So authorities began to suspect that Samuel Green was in cahoots with Harriet Tubman, who was also from the same county in Maryland. And they came to his house one night, and they raided his house looking for evidence that he was actually helping his congregants escape slavery. They found nothing that would pin absolutely on him that he was freeing slaves, but what they did find was a copy of the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And for a black person in Maryland in the 1850s to own a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, it was against the law. Oh. So he was arrested, tried, found guilty of owning a book, and sentenced to 10 years hard labor in Maryland penitentiary. The case became a cause célèbre for Maryland abolitionists and also Maryland state slaveholders who wanted to make an example of a Methodist minister who would dare preach about freedom or own this book. And eventually, after 5 years of the sentence, it was commuted. So he left prison. His wife had moved next to the penitentiary so she could be with him as close as possible. She was there for 5 years. They lost everything in this affair, and they left to go north to Canada. On the way to Canada, they stopped in Hartford, Connecticut, where they met with Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Oh, my goodness.
And there, he told her the whole story of his preaching freedom and reading the book, and she said, well, what did you think of the book? And he said, I never finished it. Oh. And at that point, she was really surprised. She went off to her library, got him a copy of her book, signed it to him, and then gave it to him and sent him and his wife on their way. After that, we never hear from them again in history. But it was this amazing story of a man who put freedom at the center of the gospel and paid the price for it.
Diana, a people's history of Christianity, you say, is really the history of the prophetic Jesus. And you dedicate it so beautifully and lovingly to your daughter, Emma Catherine Bass, about 12 years old now. Tell us, this wonderful 12-year-old daughter of yours represents the future. So carry us into the future. Toward the end of the book, you use the metaphor of a river, the fluid faith, and so on. I guess I want to ask you, how's the water these days, and what you hope Emma will take from this?
Oh, I actually have a lot of hopes and dreams about what Emma will take from it, because when I published the book and dedicated it to her, she was so proud that her mom had done this. So one day in Sunday school, she was talking to another kid in the 5th grade Sunday school class, and she said, oh, my mom has a new book that came out. And he said, well, what's it about? And she said, it's a history of Christianity. And in the Sunday school classroom, a kid raised in the church, he looked at her and said, what's that about? Killing Jews and Muslims? And my daughter's face just dropped, and she came back down from the Sunday school from me, and she looked like someone had hit her with a brick. And she said, Mom, is that what your book is about? Is that what Christians do? Is kill Jews and Muslims? And I said, honey, no, that's not what Mommy's book is about. I said, some Christians have done that, and it's wrong, and that it should never, never, never happen again.
Well, it's so interesting because she's your daughter, so she's received this wonderful different history of Christianity, but why is it that for so many of us in school or in university, the history of religion, the history of Christianity is sort of the Crusades and all the horrors and all the fighting and all the internecine feuds, What's driving that?
I don't entirely know. I think part of it is an appropriate sense that Christians have had over the last 20 or 30 years to examine the dark sides of their history. And many fine historians have done that in an extraordinary manner. I think of that wonderful book, Constantine's Sword, for example, on anti-Semitism. And that's necessary, and that needs to happen. But there's something in the air right now that little boy in the Sunday school could pick up.
What your daughter's friends who made those remarks perhaps were referring to what you write about, the big C Christianity, as opposed to the generative Christianity, the transforming aspect of the faith. Can you say more about that? What your scholarly friend told you, you refer to in the beginning of the book. She doesn't have a problem with Jesus. She's a non-believer.
It's everything that happens.
It's everything that happened after Jesus that made her mad.
Well, Willimon says people love Jesus, they just don't like his friends.
Right.
So can you address that, the difference?
Well, I think that that's the problem with that big C story, is that there are Christians who have peddled that story, and they've done it for political purposes. Most often in recent years, the religious right has had a very strong investment in that big C story, the victory of Christianity.
Power domination.
Yeah, exactly.
Is what you're,
militarism going along with
what are the
big,
for our viewers,
a Christian
the big
empire.
Cs?
The big C's are, once again, they're Christ, Constantine, Christendom, the Crusades, Calvin, and then a Christian America.
So the militancy of that brand of Christianity.
I call it Christian Manifest Destiny. And the implication, of course, is that it's going to continue until all the ends of the earth are vanquished under the rule of a particular kind of imperial Christianity. And so people have said, this is it, this is the story. And a lot of folks, you know, sort of, they hear that story because they hear it from pastors and preachers on TV. The problem is that folks like Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and the wonderful writers who are neo-atheists, they hear that story and they say, well, that's it, that's Christianity. And boy, isn't that just awful. You know, and good for you all. Manifest destiny, you might have won the war, but you have lost the battle. And I think that the remark of the 5th grader in Sunday school with my daughter is a lost the battle kind of remark. When even Christians look at this story, and sensitive ones see all the problems with it.
And yet one of the gifts that you've given to the church and to the country is that you go around and tell the positive stories, not just in history, but the remarkable things that are going on in congregations today.
Yeah, and I try not to be, you know, Sally Sunshine about the whole thing, because I do know the darkness and how hard it is to have a good congregation or to have a good church.
In 5 seconds, who's going to contribute most to the 21st century of Christianity?
I think it's an amazing amount of people in their 20s and 30s right now who are breaking through all the boundaries and trying to create what I would call a generative faith
and
based
we've got
on love.
one of